Okay, well, welcome back again to our PMBOK 5 deep dive. Now we're at Module 12. We're going to talk about planning and establishing the project scope baseline. Now, everything else we've done prior to this, identifying or getting our project charter that authorizes us to do all these things. Our project management plan is starting to create itself, be populated, progressively elaborated. We've identified our stakeholders. We know how to manage them. We know how to communicate with them. We have our project team in place. And if this were a sequential world, again, these things would all happen integrated, interactive in some manner in the real world. But in our little world right here, now and only now, we're at the point where we can, with confidence, go out and establish the scope on a project charter, which is a key input to this process. But we need to elaborate that tremendously to get very detailed work items on exactly what we're going to be able to satisfy the stakeholders' needs and expectations. So this is the real meat right here of producing the project deliverables. So as you see here, we're going to plan how we're going to do all this. Then we're going to go out and collect the requirements from the stakeholders, ongoing way, not just once, many times. And then we're going to take those requirements and finally define officially the scope, and we're going to baseline it in our WBS. And then we're going to go on and build all that work. So here's what we're going to do. First, let's define scope management according to basically what PMBOK defines it as. Project scope management is all about this. It's all about ensuring that the project includes all the work required, only the work required, in order to complete the project successfully, with much attention to what is not included in the project scope. Remember last module I said some software jobs are put out there and 40% or so of the functionality that may work just great, but it's never used because the client didn't really want it. That's what's not included, should not have been included in the project scope because they did a poor job of collecting the requirements. So we need to avoid that so that all of our money, all of our effort, all of our time go in exclusively to satisfying the real stakeholders' needs and expectations and requirements. So scope management. Okay, there we are. Again, remember what a process is. It's the activities designed to produce a certain output. So that's what we're doing here. Here's our scope management process group processes. We're going to look at this a little different way at this moment. So we have a planning process group, and here's what's in that planning process group. We're going to plan scope management, collect the requirements, define the scope, create the WBS, and then we're going to go on into monitoring and controlling process group, where we're going to validate the scope. Remember the life cycle of a deliverable? After it's produced as a deliverable, it goes into first quality, and then it goes into scope to validate the scope, and then it goes to the final deliverable. And also under monitoring and controlling, we need to control the scope to avoid basically scope creep, or to compensate for new requirements and get them into the mix. Notice what's not here is executing. You don't execute the scope. You execute the project management plan that includes the scope baseline. So there is no specific executing here in scope management. That's under executing and controlling, executing the project. So here's our knowledge area box here with the process groups. The first four that we're going to talk about right in this module are planning group processes. We're going to do all this planning, and then the project management plan with all this stuff is going to go out, we're going to execute it, and then we're going to monitor and control it by validating and controlling. So those are the processes and where they fit in the process groups. So scope management, it's a key foundational knowledge area because this is what you're going to build. It's what you're going to produce and deliver. So it better be right. Defining, progressively elaborating the requirements, that's critically important, and everything else is based on the quality you do in this scoping process. Another reason you should not sit down in front of your project, Microsoft project, and start whipping up whatever schedule you think you need, because you don't know unless you do this first. So this is kind of an odd-looking knowledge area overview, but what I've done is, just for your own edification, I've encircled here all of the planning group processes. You can see there's a lot of them. And then they go out into executing process group, where under 4.3, direct and manage, that is where you build the stuff, that is where your deliverable, quote, deliverable, unquote, is an output that goes in then to quality, to scope, and back to your client. So it goes out there and it comes back in here from 8.3, comes in as a verified deliverable over here. So, and then finally out to closing. So that's kind of, again, another little depiction of how the various knowledge areas, inputs, outputs relate to each other, which we saw in more detail earlier when we looked at integration management. So here's our ITO, input, tool, technique, and output diagram. The plan, we're talking about the scope management plan here, and now we have this other item called requirements management plan, which is in table 4.1 under the project management plan components is a definite component of that plan. It's not a project document. It is a project management plan component, your requirements management plan. So the plan documents is how the scope is defined, how you develop the scope, and how you monitor it by validating and controlling it. Key benefits are you have documented guidance and direction on how you're going to handle scope, and it certainly, if you do it properly, it will reduce scope creep, because you don't want this thing to end up in either a quality control or a scope validation. Say that's not what they asked for. Big problem. Depending on what you built, it could be a lot of money, time wasted. So plus your own reputation for doing a poor job at defining the scope. So pay particular attention to how you do this. So here's the data flow diagram. Here's our process. We're going to look at it right here, planning our scope management. Just for kicks, just to remind you, here's your sources of information. Inputs are these things, outputs are over there. You should all know that by now, so you won't see this again. But you have inputs from your organization, your usual kinds of classifications of things, the EFs and OPAs, of which in this context of scope are particular things, which we'll see. Your primary input early in the game especially is your project charter, because that's all you may have, and in our little scenario here, that's all we do have at this point in time. Later, once we do the scope management plan, we have our WBS in place and all that, then the project management plan input will have much more value to us, because it will have the scope baseline in it, which is already fixed. It's fixed. Here's what you're going to build because of your WBS, and now we may have to update it because the client needs something different. So we'll go through all those changes and update it, and maybe have to re-baseline it. So this will become of more value, more importance later on in the game. Right now, it's just guidance on how we are to help build the plan and all that stuff. And now the output of planning, the main output of this process is the scope management plan itself, which is used to help guide us as we collect the requirements, define the scope, and define the work breakdown structure. The companion output is the requirements document that goes specifically into collect requirements, because that is what you need to look at in particular as you review with your stakeholders to make sure that your requirements plan is correct and the actual requirements are correct. So here's our inputs again. It begins with an approved. Now by now you need to have your plan, your project management plan actually approved through change control, which is the best place to do it. At some point you're going to want to move on now and start actually collecting your scope, and you don't want to do that unless if your plan is still out there in the Ethernet, just not ready for prime time yet. But at some point, even though it's not complete, because it's always under progressive elaboration, but at some point you're going to lock your plan and say, okay, here, let's start with this now, go from there and get what we can, and then go back and refine it. So at some point you want to actually have an approved plan and subsidiary plans, whatever's in there. And your project charter early in the game, like here, is a major input, as I said, because that may be all you have at this point in time, because it will give you, major milestones, what the client thinks they want in a very, maybe it's verbose, but it's still very unclarified manner of what the scope they want and other things. So that's all you may have. Your environmental factors, again, the culture, the infrastructure, could be, why would we say this, the culture here? Well, the culture is, boy, we're going to build that system that this project is going to build. We're going to want this kind of thing, and all this stuff goes on. So the culture may have a lot of influences and to come to bear on you and the main stakeholders. So it's an issue you got to deal with. Personnel administration policies, because people are going to have to build this stuff. So personnel has to come to bear. Of course, your stakeholders are the main influence out there, because they're going to give you the requirements. And the marketplace too, because as you start to refine and build your scope, what's out there in the marketplace may suffice that you may want to purchase stuff under procurement instead of building it yourself, but it's still a requirement. So that's why the marketplace may have a bearing on this. And internally, with your organizational process assets, of course, you may have policies and procedures on how you would best create your scope management plan, because that's where we're at right now. Historical information, lessons learned, how they do it in the past, so you don't go crazy and do it some oddball way, waste time when it could be more efficient another way. So that's your inputs. Look at the tools and techniques. Boy, they look pretty easy, don't they? Well, again, we don't have much to go with right here. Expert judgment, what's the benefit? You get knowledgeable input from experienced people that have done stakeholder scope management plans in the past. So build off successes and avoid failures either way. Who are they? Any group with specialized education, knowledge, skill, experience, training in developing scope management plans. Find those people if you can. They can help you. Meetings. Who participates? Anybody that has experience doing this that can help you build the plan you want to go get. Even when the project management plan is more developed and it becomes the primary input instead of the project charter, you still, expert judgment, help me with this. We have better information now. How can we best use it? Have your meetings with anybody that can help you build your scope management plan. And we're going to talk about the outputs in a moment. Okay, well, now we're going to wrap up the first process of scope management with the outputs of our scope management plan development. And here's what it is. The scope management plan is what? It's your how-to, it's your guideline, like any other plan. It's your how-to and your guideline. And in this case, it's how are you going to prepare your scope statement, so you do it that way. How are you going to prepare and maintain your work breakdown structure? And if you don't know what a work breakdown structure is, that's okay. We'll get to that in a while. And how are you going to formally accept your deliverables that you produce from the scope plan? And then how are you going to manage changes when changes need to be made because your stakeholder needs them to the scope statement. So, and a scope statement is a particular document that we'll talk about. So this is the how-to, that's the plan. The companion output to this is your requirements management plan, which is a project management plan component. And this says how are requirements going to be analyzed, documented, and managed, because you're going to get these things from your stakeholders. So how are you going to analyze what they're saying? How are you going to document them? How are you going to manage them over time in case they change their mind or whatever? How are the requirements planned now to build? How are they prioritized in your schedule? How are they tracked in your schedule and other things? And then how do you report progress and things like that? How are your requirements going to be, if they require certain configurations in their certain settings, how are you going to manage those so that when it goes to quality control, they can check those things? And then there's this document, which in this case happens to be a project document, not a project management plan component, but actual project document, called a requirements traceability matrix. And what the purpose of that is, as we will see, is once you get all these requirements down there, again, it's like the software program where they delivered it and almost half of it wasn't really needed. You need to take all your requirements, put them in this matrix, and then trace it from where you have it documented, from who gave you the requirement, to actually, remember chapter 1 and 2, organizational strategies and how projects need to contribute to those. The requirement matrix then takes it a step back there and says, okay, here's the requirement. Why does this support the mission, the strategy that this project was conceived and authorized to do? So you got to have that links. If you can't really say, well, we're doing this, but why does it apply to this? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you don't need that feature. Okay, so it's a good document to trace all that back, requirements traceability matrix. So we'll see that in detail in a while. So here it is, 5.2, collecting requirements. Here's our ETO. Identify all stakeholder requirements. What this really should say is identify all stakeholder requirements from all stakeholders. You'd never know who may have a good idea about this project. Oh, even the unaware. I didn't know that was that project. Well, good, I'm glad you're doing it. Make sure you do this because that's going to help us in my little unit here. Maybe the main stakeholder didn't think about that little unit. They're just thinking about their project or the project that they did for their unit, but it could benefit somebody else. So that's another requirement. You need to deal with it. Does the main stakeholder want it? If it's going to benefit somebody else, they may say, oh, yeah, put that in there. So all stakeholder requirements from all stakeholders. Key benefits, that's your basis to define, manage the project and finally the product or deliverable scope and capture all stakeholder requirements. Here's our data flow. Let's look at that. Here's our main process in the middle. The main input project charter at this point. I'm sorry, you use the project charter to perhaps validate some of the requirements you're getting against the project charter's business statement of work. Say, well, here's a requirement you're saying, but really it wasn't the statement of work. Why do you want this? And you just have to resolve that issue. So the charter. The stakeholder register comes in because you know who to talk to now for your requirements. That's your main audience. You on the project team may think, oh, good, this project, oh, they ought to do this, this, and that. No, maybe, but no. You got to listen to your stakeholders. They're the ones that give you the requirements. And then your outputs, main outputs are your requirements document that go into other processes under collect requirements or under your scope management. And the requirements plan or document in particular, now that you have that, like I mentioned earlier, goes into quality management so they can start whipping up the metrics and those things that they're going to compare and assess against the actual requirement deliverable, make sure it's proper. And requirements also may apply to external procurements. So they need to know, what's required because maybe they need to buy something. So we'll see that later. But internally within scope management knowledge area, the main thing here is your requirements document and then the traceability matrix that you use to validate scope and then control scope. So collect requirements. There are 3 plans that come in to help you do this. They're your how-tos, your scope management plan, requirements management plan, and your stakeholder management plan. The charter is used to validate and review about high-level scope and deliverables statement that they have in there. to make sure everything jives up and everything makes sense. Stakeholder register, that's your list of stakeholders. Your scope refinement interview roster, that's who you're going to talk to, all those people, to see what they think the requirements should be for this project. Here's a key PMBOK concept. Project success is directly influenced by active stakeholder involvement in the discovery and decomposition of needs into requirements. So a key concept, it's the project success is based on stakeholders, discovering stakeholders' needs and breaking them down into requirements. Your stakeholder, they're not going to give you 100 work items. They're going to give you main items. You need to break those down into the individual work items that will produce that requirement. Go over it with the stakeholders. Say, here's the things we're going to do that are going to, create that deliverable for you. Or you may not even need to tell them that information. If they really need to know, you need to tell them. Otherwise, just say, yes, sir, thank you. Here's the requirement. We will do that. And then in your own team, you will worry about breaking it down to build what they want. Now look at these tools and techniques. There are 11 of them. This is the most we've seen so far, which means what to you and me? This would mean that collecting the requirements requires many, many different tools and techniques to really adequately and successfully define a proper scope definition, scope requirements. Okay, a lot of them. So we're going to go through these. So, like I said, what to say about it when all you have is, the plan, the requirements plan, stakeholder management plan, charter. What does it mean? Well, it's very important, this collect requirements process. It's very complex. A lot of things you may need to do, and you may only use one or two of these things on your project. More complex projects with multiple deliverables, multiple phases, you may need many of these things. So it all depends. So here's again where you can tailor the processes to your project. You would now look here, and this makes more sense looking at the scope management because it just makes more sense when you talk about this. You'd say, okay, here's basically what we need. We're not going to need this, but we're certainly going to need this. So you can tailor things and maybe and then not need to deal with some of these techniques. It all depends on your project, and it's up to you to figure that out. But that's available to you to tailor your project, so you're only working on and using the tools that you really need to use. You're building a house. You're not going to use a paintbrush to hammer a nail in, although a paintbrush may be an available tool. You can use the right tool. You can use a hammer. Okay, many options to approach. So let's go through these. This will take a few minutes, so let's take a quick break, and we'll come back here in a minute and go through all these. Okay, let's talk about these 11 tools and techniques that PMBOK prescribes for us to collect requirements. Again, we're not obligated to use all these, of course. You can tailor them to what you need for your project. You may even use something different that's not even on this list if that's what you need to do. But again, PMBOK gives you the best practice, and it saves you a lot of time and effort if you can adopt these things to your project and use them as needed. So let's look at them in a little detail here. Interviews, obviously you talk. This is your primary method of at least aggregating all the requirements more quickly up front, and that's just to talk to the stakeholders. That's the prime thing you can do. Talk to them. Okay, what do you mean by this statement in the project charter? They may not know because it was written by another person in the unit. That was your business statement of work. Or they may know, or whatever it is, you talk to them and they say, okay, well, it ought to be this, and you document that. It ought to be that. It ought to be blue. It ought to be this. It got to do this. You can get a lot of information here. Don't kid yourself. This is work, but in the end, it's going to be good work because it's going to save you a lot, and it'll lead your project towards success. So interview is the primary thing. You may need focus groups. Again, this is where if things are just that big and that complicated and you have a lot of decisions to make, options, alternatives amongst your requirements that you may receive, you may need to do focus groups that has a skilled moderator there with pre-qualified stakeholders this time, those who are most in the know for the bulk of the requirements. You want to get them in a room with subject matter experts to hash it out, and you can learn more about their attitudes and their expectations. A lot of times focus groups have people in a room, with the glass on the wall. You have people taking notes in the back so that they're not intimidated by who's back there, but they take notes in the back so that you get more honest, open opinions about things, and then they take it from there. And again, you can use many of these things together or over time in the project. Anyway, here's your facilitated workshops. Okay, this is sort of like a focus group, but it's out in the open with everybody. You can define product, cross-functional requirements. You have more than one product. You can resolve differences in this meeting, come to agreements. You can do joint application development. VOC is the voice of the customer. He says, it's got to be like this. Well, okay, you do that. In the agile environment, if you're doing that kind of project management life cycle, a project approach. That is, you can use user stories. Well, we need this. We'd like to have this, so that it'll happen like this. In the end, we'll get an output like that. A user story, and you got to translate that into requirements. And how would you make that happen? Group creativity techniques. Again, we've seen some of these. Brainstorming. You just, what do you think we need? Everybody get everybody's input, sort them out, classify them, qualify them, put them up on the board, sort them out. Okay, here's the main ones. You don't want this, put them over there, and that kind of brainstorming. Nominal group technique is another approach, similarly to gathering requirements and ideas and things. Mind mapping is a cool little tool where you have a central idea. I need it to do this. Well, you can have people, your processes, outputs, needs, functionality, and branch out from there, and you can sort things out in a good manner with mind maps. Affinity analysis is another technique, and all these, by the way, are in the PMBOK. You can look at these and get more detail, which is what you should do. Remember, if your intent is just to listen to this series and go out and take the test, it's not likely you're going to get that far on the test with just this. You need this plus reinforcing it with more detail that's in the PMBOK. Otherwise, we'd have a series here that's 2 weeks long, and we can't have that. So this gives you the prime major focuses. Now go out and get the details so you really understand it, and then you'll have a much, much better chance of passing the test and understanding the questions. But anyway, affinity analysis is, we need this, what helps us do those kind of things. Multi-criteria decision analysis, we talked about that earlier, go research that again, but those are group activity techniques for defining the requirements and coming up with a short list of the real requirements, hopefully. Other group decision-making techniques, unanimity, the majority, plurality, 2 people doing this, dictatorship, no, it's going to be this way, whatever, that could be a stakeholder, you got to deal with that, whatever it is, that is a tool that at least it will give you input. Even if it says, no, it's got to be this, you take that back and you figure out, how are we going to do this? Is it appropriate? Do we need more information? What do we need? At least you know what they want and deal with it. Questionnaires and surveys are a very unpretentious way of gathering information, and it may be a way of getting more open, free-form responses from the people you question. It's good for, here it says geographically dispersed people, send it out in an email, fill this in, send it back, please. Okay, quick turnaround. Observations, maybe you're updating a system, project update some system that's there. You can watch people working at it and seeing, oh, I see why they may need a requirement to do this because they're having difficulty doing this. You can, by doing that, you can observe and get some requirements. Not a very strong way, but it's an option you have to help. Prototypes, you can storyboard things, build a working model, progressively elaborate that over time, but you can have prototypes that will prove requirements or disprove requirements. Another tool you have, benchmarking. You need to build a project that does a certain thing. Here we know that there's another tool or application or product out there that does similar in another organization maybe that is similar to the requirements that we think we want for this project. You benchmark it. Are what we think the requirements are on a par with what they are doing because they're successful, or are the requirements we're getting not on a par with them, or are because it's not successful, so we don't want to do these things. So you can find things out by benchmarking, comparing against something that exists. Context diagrams, business analysis model. Maybe there's process flows involved with your product. You need to build context diagrams on how things would work. Visual depictions of systems, people, how things would work, help you define requirements. Here's a person here doing this at a PC and over here, and this person needs these kind of inputs to get what they want. Those may be requirements, so you document them. That may help you sort out the actual requirements in the end. Document analysis. Existing documentations from things may give you requirements. Oh, here's documentation that says this. That's a good feature. Maybe that's a requirement. Check with your stakeholder. So yeah, that's what we need, that kind of thing. So that's document analysis. So all of these 11 tools, one way or another, will help you define how you're collecting your requirements and actually to help you collect your requirements. Again, in particular, interviews with your stakeholders, but all these other things may come into play depending on the nature of the product or your deliverable that you're intending to build. Now, by the way, when we get into validate scope, remember when you actually do build something according to the requirements, first it goes into quality control to make sure that how you've built it meets your quality metrics, you're within tolerances of things and so on, and then it goes into validate scope that says, okay, it's built properly. Is this actually meet a requirement that the client wanted? When you get there, you will have exactly these same 11 tools and techniques in 5.5 validate scope for the same reasons. Okay, here we have it. Is it what we want? You may have to have interviews, focus groups. Here's what it is. It doesn't meet these requirements because it may not be obvious. So you'll get these again later. So the output is the actual requirements document. which is your individual requirements meeting the business need, and they have to be unambiguous, they have to be complete requirements, consistent, but they have to be traceable back to the actual need of the business, so that you're producing what not only the project and the stakeholder, what the stakeholder needs, but also it meets the needs of the corporation or the company that authorized the project. They gave you the money to spend to build your project, so they expect to receive what they expect to get in the beginning, so requirements doc. And here's your traceability matrix. It's your product requirements or your deliverables requirements from the origin to satisfy the deliverables all the way up to the corporation actually, and it links. Here's your link to your business need and your project objectives. Your business need, your project objectives, got to have that linkage in there, or otherwise you need to question your stakeholders. Well, why are we doing this? It doesn't support what their need. Do we really need this requirement? And it traces all requirements that you come up with, whether they're active, they're the real thing, or maybe you canceled them, or maybe you say, well, they're good, but we're going to defer them because we don't really maybe need them now, and we don't want them to end up in this 40% of delivered stuff that we're never going to use. So you do that, and of course, completed. When you complete them, you keep that on the matrix also. So that's what the requirement matrix, traceability matrix is. And again, there's examples of this in your PMBOK, so have a look at it so you can see what they're talking about. So we're going to talk about now defining the scope. Now that we've collected the requirements in the requirements document and we've traced them in the requirements traceability matrix to say, yes, this is really needed and it links with the corporate strategy vision, it will fulfill that while we fulfill it for the project and the stakeholder. Now we're going to then take that and define the scope officially so that we can baseline it and then start to put our schedule together on how we're going to build it. So we'll do that next. We'll be back in a minute. Okay. Here's our scope management knowledge area overview again. We've looked at 5.1. We've planned how we're going to do scope management. In 5.2, in our prior module, we've collected now our requirements from the stakeholders using various methods. We've refined them down into a requirements document, and we've put them into a traceability matrix so that we know that they're real and that they're needed and that they apply to the business value eventually. So now that we've done that, we're going to prepare what's called the project scope statement, which is the official scope statement that we're going to build our detailed build list off of. Now again, the project scope statement obviously is different than the project statement of work, which was the very high level swag at what the requirements should be way back pre-project charter from the business. That was their first shot. That's why they got the project approved in the first place. They need this kind of thing. Now we got to detail it very finely, in a very fine detail in the first, the project scope statement, which is a little broader, and then finally in the work breakdown structure that we'll see in process 5.4. And then finally, as you can see on here, if you look under 5.4 outputs, you'll see the scope baseline. That is the final official locked version, baseline version of what we're going to build. Then you can go off and start to schedule it and then finally build it. So, but even before then, now we got to come up with the scope statement because it is a component of the scope baseline. So let's start looking at that. So basically what happens here is now we have a requirements document, which is our overall view of the main requirements that the client wants. And we're going to transform that through certain tools and techniques into the scope statement, which is a very key document in project management here and in scope development. Here's our data flow diagram. Here's our main inputs, scope management plan, how we're going to do these things. And now we've collected the requirements, so the requirements documentation as a result of that comes in now to define scope. And again, this is progressively elaborated. You're going to continue to work with your stakeholders and so on, refine the requirements document as needed. And hopefully you can do the bulk of this before you finally get your scope baseline, because that's your lock in place. After that, you got to have change control, and it'll affect your schedule or your costs some way, triple constraint, remember? So you want to do the most of this the best you can at getting this stuff resolved before you finally scope your baseline your scope. So now we're going to define the scope better, basically, than the requirements document. We're going to make it a better, refined, defined scope. And the output is, main output is the scope statement that finally goes into creating our work breakdown structure, which is the detailed work activities at the lowest level that makes sense so that somebody can sit down and do that thing, say, I'm done, do the next thing, I'm done, do the next thing, I'm done, and finally you've created, in the aggregate, some kind of a deliverable, or a major part of the main deliverable called a work package. You do work packages, we'll see about those. But that's the objective here, is to create your scope statement well enough so that you can now break that down into the actual work activities needed to produce that requirement. And your scope statement then, again, these things are interactive. They should be working all together at the same time to some degree. That makes sense. The scope statement also is an input to your sequencing your activities. You know, now that you have scope, you need to know basically when you're going to do these things. The WBS itself will give you very detailed information about how to sequence your activities, but at one level, you're going to use your scope statement to validate against that. And the durations of that, and finally, to actually develop the schedule. Finally, down here in 6.6, when we get to that, and knowledge area 6 is your time management, we're going to finally start sitting down in front of project schedule and creating a schedule. So you can see why it's bad to sit on right at the beginning. So, oh, I can do this. Well, no, you can't. You need all this stuff to do a good job. So anyway, here we are, defining scope. Major inputs are our requirements document. That's your primary reference right now. That's the distillation and the consolidation, aggregation of all your conversations with your stakeholders, all those tools and techniques to finally decide that this is the requirements. You're going to leverage your organizational process assets of historical information, lessons learned to make sure that there were no hidden problems that other projects came into at this point of the game that you may want to avoid or capitalize on. So those are your main requirements here. Well, let's go back a second. You also have some organizational process assets, which is, I did say it specifically, but you see it here. That's your historical information and so on. Your charter also comes in, just again as a primary reference to make sure you're still, you know, on the right path for things. And it may have some information in there that would help you, but at this point now, it's less important or less effective to use that information because now you're really refining it. And of course, your scope management plan is an input because that's, you know, the how you're going to do all these things functionally. So here's the tools and techniques to define the scope. Not surprisingly, you're going to ask experts, okay, I have these requirements. How now am I going to create my scope statement? Can you, you know, I've not done this before perhaps, and can you help me, guide me do this? So you're going to ask for help from units within your organization that have experience in this. You may need to bring in this is so important that you get this right the first time around. You know, you may need a consultant to come in and help you do it that has skills and expertise in doing these things that will be well worth the money if you think, you know, that you just really can't do it well enough yourself to avoid problems in the future. So you may want a consultant. Your stakeholders, of course, are the main people that you've asked for the requirements, so they're always available to you to refine and define and clarify and whatever you need from them. Professional and technical associations, if you belong to them, you know, they have vast resources that you may not even realize that can help you define scope, give you guidance and things like that. Like the same thing with industry groups, and of course your subject matter experts themselves, whoever they may be, and of course consultants and stakeholders and groups, they're all part of being subject matter experts themselves anyway. So all these people can help you define the scope or your scope statement because it is so very important. Now you have your requirements and you're looking to build your scope statement, so you know what you're doing is you need to do some product analysis because the product is the deliverable, whether it's a product, an activity, or you know a transition of service, whatever it may be. You need to break it down, whatever that might be, make sure all the requirements fit what they think they want in the end, and then do some system value engineering analysis. You know, and this is defined more in the PMBOK. So read that paragraph to understand what that means. But you need to do product analysis of your initial requirements document that came in, so that you can create your scope statement in the best possible, reasonable, clarified, comprehensive manner. Now maybe, you know, there may be alternatives to accommodating all those requirements. What might those be? Additional, optional approaches. How are you going to execute the work? In-house, outside, get somebody else to do it. Different ways. So alternatives on how you're going to produce your scope statement is interesting. So read up on that. It just means there's not only one way of doing things. You may need to use facilitated workshops, which is this cross-functional group you have in there where they all have a common understanding of things, or at least so that you can arrive at a common understanding of how you're going to create your scope given the requirements. So again, whatever help you need that you can get is a benefit to you, so go get it. This is very important right at this point right here. So here's the outputs, the scope statement. It's got your scope description. It has acceptance criteria for the various requirements. It describes the deliverable itself to whatever degree is necessary. Again, remember, scope is only build what you got to build and make sure you don't build what you don't need to build. So that's just product exclusions. Make sure that you are specific so you don't end up with this 40% of functionality that nobody wants. And you want to document constraints in your scope, assumptions you make, and you got to manage your constraints and assumptions over time here because they may become real. But just the definition of assumption is, I don't know what that is, I assume it's this, but it may not be. So you got to document your assumptions and manage them as part of your scope statement. and your document updates, your stakeholder register may be adjusted, your requirements document itself may be adjusted now as you learn more and as you produce your scope statement, and your traceability matrix may change a bit too. So those are your main outputs. So your scope statement is your broad statement of, here is exactly the scope we need, and now we need to break this down into actual functional activities to build it so that the scope can be achieved. And we do that through progressive elaboration. Now let me talk about this a little bit more before we move on in a minute. Okay, before we complete defining scope, we're talking about the outputs of the project scope statement. I'm putting up a slide here again about progressive elaboration. This is pretty good, and this is in your PMBOK, by the way, but this is good that really shows how progressive elaboration works. On the left you have your project charter, and this was the first document you created, and you based it off the only thing you knew was the business statement of work, what they think they needed in a broad sense at that time. They may think this is great, this is exactly what we're going to want, let's give it to them. Well, it's nowhere near what you need to build the product for them. So here's how progressive elaboration works at this point. You have your project purpose justification, you have some maybe success criteria, fine. Now you have your high-level requirements, high-level project description, high-level risks, summary milestones way back then when the business thinks they need things to be done based to support their own business processes, summary budget, and a preliminary stakeholder list. Remember, stakeholder list versus stakeholder register, two different things. Approval requirements and project manager assignment authority and all that. But basically the high-level requirements description are now progressively elaborated through all of this stakeholder conversation, interviews, collecting requirements, creating a requirements document that now is transformed into your project scope statement, and the project scope statement itself will be a part of the official scope baseline that includes your detailed work building activities that support the scope. See how it's elaborated over that time now into the actual progressively elaborated project scope description with acceptance criteria, with actual project deliverables. And remember, you build what they want, and you don't want to get in there what they don't want. So that's your project exclusions. You need to be specific so that it's not vague or nebulous. We're doing this. Here's our scope. The scope does not include these things, and does not go beyond these boundaries, however you want to define it. And of course, your constraints and assumptions. So you can see how we've morphed from very high-level stuff through the processes that you've done to create all these other interim documents to finally the scope statement, where it's now very well defined relative to the charter. So that's your process, progressive elaboration. And of course, the main way you do this is through tools and techniques at this point, through your requirements document, through your expert judgment, your product analysis, alternatives, facilitated workshops. Finally, you come up with the project scope statement. Here's another important PMBOK concept. Remember, and I've said this many times, and I'll just say it here again in writing, all processes are highly interactive, iterative. Your team must decide what actions are best to take at any point in time, tailoring, given any particular project environment. So just remember that again. Now here's something I'd like you to do. We can't put all that many words in these slides, and I could talk forever, but I want you to point out something in particular here. Pull out your PMBOK. You should all have this by now. If not, you should have had this express delivered overnight to you so that you have it. But I want you to turn to page 123 and look at process 5.3.3, where it says define scope outputs, 5331, the project scope statement. This is what we're talking about. Now, I want you to be sure you read this so you understand exactly what the scope statement is. So let's look at that. This is the description of the project scope. It includes, it tells what the major deliverables are, finally at this point, major deliverables, which it shows here in the scope statement box right there. Of course, assumptions and constraints. But the project deliverables and all the work required, you can elaborate on the work that's required that you think at this point, which will again be progressively elaborated when you do your work breakdown structure. That is where you really get specific on the actual start here, do this, end here, it costs that much, and these people are going to do that. Okay, that's the very detailed, but the next best thing is the scope statement, where you could have broader requirements on how you're going to build that deliverable, the work required. And the big benefit of the scope statement here is and I said this in one way or another, but here, read this so you understand it. It provides a common understanding now amongst the project team and the stakeholders. This is good that you need this scope statement. This is the best thing you have so far to define what you're ultimately going to build. It explicitly excludes certain things, so that's very clear, so that doesn't get into the product mix, and it enables the team now, it says here, to perform more detailed planning during work execution, which basically means it's going to help you tremendously to build out your work breakdown structure. And finally, what it says here, and this is pretty cool, it provides the baseline. It is not an official baseline in itself, but it provides a little b baseline for evaluating later whether requests for changes or additions to the work are actually contained within this project boundary. So you need to make this a very good scope statement so that it's of real value to you, not just now for the WBS, for later. It's your sounding board for change requests. You can look at it and say, at least at the beginning, okay, this could be a valid change, or this is a change that's really going to change the scope. We need to do something about it. So make sure you understand that, and you should be doing this anyway. You should be reading every word in this book eventually to really be successful in in two things, in passing your exam and in your own professional career. You need to use these concepts as much as you can, hopefully, to help you do a better job. So that's the project scope statement. Now here is the WBS. Now here's the real nitty-gritty. What exactly and how are we going to build those requirements and produce that deliverable? So here's your ETO. Now the WBS, work breakdown structure, is a structured vision. It's a hierarchy of the deliverables. And it is the scope baseline. It's an official baseline that you use for project control. Okay, and it is an integral part of the project management plan. So this is another big enchilada right here. You got to get this right, because once this is baseline, you're off and you're spending money. Your resources are doing work. They're building stuff. You don't want to build it wrong, whatever that is. So here's our data flow diagram for create the WBS. Requirements doc come in, scope management plan as guidance comes in, your project scope statement, which is your main document now that you're going to decompose into your work breakdown structure. And decompose is a big word here when you're talking work breakdown structure. That's taking a requirement and breaking it up into parts that you need to accomplish to produce that item. So that's coming in here, and then eventually it'll be validated scope that you use, your WBS. Here's your scope statement. It's used by a lot of external processes. We won't get into detail now. Look at them, and when we get to 6, time management, 7, cost management, 11, risk, and 12, or what 12 is under 11, risk, you'll see why you need the scope statement is valuable there. Oh, and by the way, just to refresh your mind, because you need to know what process groups any activity is in. Because if you're quizzed on this on the exam, you better know the answer, or you're going to miss a question. One question may make or break your pass-fail. It could be that close. I've heard many stories about that. So know these things. Obviously, planning is planning. Defining activity, you're defining your activities. That is a time issue. Cost down here, and risk is down here, which is what I said. So, but know which process groups they're in also. So now we're going to create the WBS. So what do we need to do that? Well, the scope management plan has guidance on how we're going to do it. Gives you some guidance. This project scope statement, that's the total body of, that's the best resource you have now of what the scope is. That's your best resource now. Everything else contributes to it. That's your best resource. That's what you're going to use to create your WBS primarily. And of course your requirements document is what you use to produce the scope statement, so that's a good reference to have, and it may be updated over time, which means then you need to correct probably your scope statement, so they're all inputs. In the environment, you may have standards. Well, why isn't a standard? You could have asked this before, maybe you have. We've seen standards as EEFs before here. Why isn't it an asset? Well, standard is something that you need to use. You don't have a control over a standard. It is what it is, so it's an environmental factor. But your actual organizational process assets, again, historical guidance, policies, much more, you can use to help you create your WBS. Whatever's available from your organization, from your PMO, wherever, you need to capitalize on those to help you. So here's the nitty-gritty of creating the WBS. 2 tools and techniques, and that is it, but they're big ones. Decomposition of your scope statement. You need to divide that scope into deliverables. Well, restate that. You need to divide the scope and the deliverables that are specified in there. You need to break them down into manageable parts, down into what's called a work package. And work packages have detailed activities under them that you would accomplish that roll up into a work package. And that work package is used to aggregate cost and duration that is reported upwards in the structure. So that's how you aggregate your cost, your individual activities into many work packages that roll up finally into a deliverable item. So, and decomposition then, identifies the deliverables specifically, breaks them down. You get a structured work breakdown structure down into smaller parts, and you always want to assign some kind of identification code so you keep track of them, because you may have hundreds. You may have hundreds, many hundreds. You may have 1,000 or more detailed work activities to produce deliverables on your project. If it's a small enough project, you may have 20 or 30. Okay, but you still need to keep track of them. So you need to assign some work breakdown structure. And in fact, if you use like Microsoft Project or other tools like that, they will self-define numbers for you as you, in kind of an outline kind of structure. So, but you need to have an ID so you can identify them. And you can verify details. So decompose them down, and we'll see a little more of that right now. And we're going to talk about this in a little more detail. It'll take a few minutes. Go out and have a drink of water, come back, and we'll talk about this. Okay, so here we are talking about decomposition of your project scope statement to create your work breakdown structure, which is the decomposed elements and the actual work items and work activities that your team would have to accomplish to build your deliverables. Again, use your PMBOK extensively, review it, absorb it. Here, this is in your PMBOK. There are a number of different views of how you could create your work breakdown structure. Here's one of them, and this is by project phase. Either all in one project, you do all phases at once, or you break it up. You do phase 1, you go back to initiate, do phase 2, etc. Whatever it is, this is how this might look. And of course, your actual work breakdown structure could be highly more complex than this, but these are the basic fundamental ways of you could approach it. Here you have your product requirements. So let's say software, user documentation, training materials, makes sense. Detailed design for software documentation, construct it, those elements, and integrate and test. So each one of these, for each one of these phases, would have its own set of detailed work activities. How are you going to create the software under construct? How are you going to design each one of those things? Very detailed stuff, and you do all that stuff, rolls up into here, and finally it rolls up into the final product, which is your main deliverable. So by phase. I mentioned this earlier, but here's where it really applies here. Whatever breakdown structure you use, you absolutely must not forget to include your own project management work, because you will be doing planning work. All this planning stuff. You're spending time, money, and people. You're doing it, so it's got to be in there. It's got to be accountable, because you're costing money. It's coming out of your project budget. Even though it's incidental to the actual deliverable, you got to account for it. So you got to have some branch somewhere that says, here's project management, here's all my planning activities, here's all the meetings and stuff, here's the administrative kind of things I need to produce my reports and do all that kind of stuff. But whatever it is, don't omit it, because how are you going to account for it? And in a highly regulated or in a very directive PMO office type of organization, you are absolutely required to do this, and they'll help you do it. In a smaller organization, you may get away with not even doing it because they don't care about money. But then, how's the next person going to know what kind of effort might be required for that project like that if you don't do this? So do it anyway. Now here's another way of looking at a work breakdown structure by the actual deliverable instead of phase. So here's your deliverables. You're trying to build an aircraft system here. Again, there's project management over there. You got to have that. But here's your major deliverables. You got to deliver training. You got to get your data. You got to build this air vehicle. You got to have support equipment done, facilities, test and evaluation. All those things down there have their own levels of work items that are needed to be done and accomplished in order to produce all those items underneath that roll up to a higher deliverable that finally all roll up to an aircraft system. Another way of looking at it. Oh, and by the way, where do you get all this stuff from? You get it from the scope statement. That's how you start to fill this stuff out. Now here's one that has some identification numbers to it. Now this is by work package. And again, work packages are an accounting concept where the work you do under them rolls up, it aggregates the cost to do it, aggregates all the time it took to do these things into a work package, so it can be accounted for and managed in that manner. Now here we have like a needs assessment. There are all these activities underneath. You need to create an audit system. So 1111 is you identify the components, component analysis, gap analysis, alternatives, all these things have some kind of work involved with doing them. These are not very clear diagrams here, and you may be misled with the complexity that may be involved with work breakdown structures, but this gives you an idea of how a work package. So all this work down in the white boxes, they have cost, duration, they're captured there as you do the work within them, and it could be, say this 1131 over here on the right, alternatives identification. If that was some other kind of sub-product that made sense to you, there may be 1, 2, 5, 10, a reasonable number of activities you need to actually do and complete that roll up into that one item being complete. And it would be roll up as a component of 113, and then that would be done as perhaps a deliverable, but it would roll up over there into a needs assessment, and all those work packages, that's a work package, so all the cost and duration will roll up into that. So eventually you can say from a project standpoint, 1.1 needs assessment took this amount of money, took this amount of time to produce all that stuff underneath. So it's an aggregate. And eventually all those work packages on that second level roll up into the final total deliverable, and the total money, the total cost, the total time to do it. And that's where you would start to compare your performance measurement baseline. I did all this much time, this much money. How did it compare with my baseline, of which these are pieces of? Then there's this thing called rolling wave planning. You know what that is? You heard that before? Rolling wave planning. Well, basically, you build your WBS, your work breakdown structure, and you do it with the things that you need to do immediately that are more urgent to accomplish. You detail them out so that you can actually say to somebody, execute these work items, and they'll go in and see what it needs to do, and basically you don't want really your individual activities to go more than a week each, for example. They're not very long. If they go longer than that, you may want to break them down even into subtasks so you can manage them more precisely. But from now, between now and a month from now or 2 months from now, you may be very detailed on the work processes that are needed to produce a piece. And you know that beyond 2 months, you got to do all this other stuff, so you're going to stub it in with sort of an aggregate kind of guess. But as you approach that, and you're going to have to start working on this now in 2 weeks, in a week, you're going to have to detail that out in more detail. That's rolling wave planning. You do what you need to do immediately, get it detailed so you do it right, and then you progressively elaborate and define and refine those that are out in the future that are vaguer into more detailed, concise stuff, so that when you get there, it's the same as you are today, very detailed stuff. You can do it, and you continue to do that so that you don't spend effort trying to detail stuff that's too far, because it really doesn't make any sense, because things may change, and what the effort you put in now to try and make stuff detailed 4 months from now may be totally wasted, because you may have to redo it all anyway. So you do your best shot, and then you refine it as you get closer, because you know more information, progressive elaboration. And there's this thing called the 100% rule. That means that no matter what you do, it all has to add up to 100%, so you don't miss anything, and this includes your project management effort. So don't miss anything, don't omit anything. You can be vague later, but refine it as you get closer to rolling wave planning, and include everything, 100% rule. By the way, PMI has a manual similar to this, although it's much thinner, and it's called the Practice Standard for Work Breakdown Structures. If you need more detail right from PMI, it's a pretty good manual. It'll give you a good head start if you really aren't familiar with work breakdown structures. If you're a PMI member, you have a big advantage because you can download it for free. So otherwise you need to purchase it. But it's a good reference. If you need it, go get it. Again, expert advice right there. And speaking of expert advice, as you're doing your decomposition, again, anybody with experience either on similar projects or those that just know how to do work breakdown structures the best, go find them, have them help you get set up so that you're consistent with the way you do your work breakdown structures as you go along. And again, the whole point of this is to break down your scope statement so that you have all the individual work items that your people need to do to produce what that scope statement says you need to have to deliver to the client eventually. So the output is the scope baseline. Now we're going to take a minute break here. I'm going to come back, and then we're going to show you why the scope baseline is so important. Okay, well, let's talk about the output, the main output, which is the scope baseline. Now this is a very official PMBOK concept, and it may be in other methodologies too, but certainly in PMBOK, and it is a composite of a few items. And here's what it is. When we're talking scope baseline, and again, baseline means it's an official approved version of what you're going to do, with the work you're going to accomplish. It consists of 3 documents. One is the project scope statement, okay, and it has to be the approved project scope statement. You don't want to be, baselining something where your scope statement is still in a state of flux. Finally, you're going to say, okay, we've gone as far as we can. We think we have a really good scope statement. We're going to start building really what we think the client wants and what they think they want, because they've reviewed the scope statement. And if appropriate, they may have reviewed your work breakdown structure, but generally they don't get to that kind of detail. They don't care how to build it. They just want to make sure it's built according to the scope statement. So you have your approved scope statement. Then you have your work breakdown structure that you have created, and it does not have to be 100% complete again. It could be the rolling wave planning kind of thing, but at this point in time, you have your work breakdown structure. And we have this concept of the work breakdown structure dictionary. This is a companion to the work breakdown structure. Now, the work breakdown structure gives the items you need to accomplish. I will build this little item here. I'll do this documentation, support it. I'll do this, whatever it is that rolls up into a work package, into a deliverable. That's what that details. Now, how are you going to build that? How are you going to build this document? How are you going to build this piece? Well, you look in the companion work breakdown structure dictionary, and it says, okay, of this 1.3.4.5 work breakdown structure work activity, Bob is going to do it. It's going to take him 5 hours to do this. It's going to cost me $250 to do that. And here's how he's going to do it. He's going to go get this, take this, put this together, and make sure this works. He's going to calculate this, get the right answer. If that's true, then he's done. Okay, so the work breakdown structure dictionary is the detail of how these people are going to build this thing, that work breakdown activity in the work breakdown structure. So those three things together are your official scope baseline. And once that is baselined, and you do that through change control, say, okay, here's my scope statement, here's my work breakdown, and the dictionary. As of today, this is the approved scope baseline. From then on, that should not change unless something else changes, like your requirements or something. And then you go on and you start to build it. But you really can't build it until you get your schedule and your timing and so on, which is downstream. But at least now you're locked in. So when you build your schedule to do this, and you create your costs associated with it, and you assign the resources to your schedule, which are the same time and resources that are in your breakdown, your dictionary. So that's how those two relate. So at least now you have a firm scope. You know what it is you need to build, how you're going to build it, and then you go off now, you schedule all that, and you get it done. So that's why you can't sit down on day one and start whipping up your project schedule, because you have no idea what you're doing. Within good project management methodology, that is. So scope baseline is the absolute primary output and is like the really big enchilada, finally, that can get us moving to build our deliverables. Once we get our supporting infrastructure in place of our schedule, so we can manage the building of this according to the breakdowns, the WBS in the dictionary. A big deal. Work breakdown structure, again, now this has not only work packages, but it has the control account. Now the work packages, if we remember, there are a bunch of them, say in your WBS, where your activities roll up into your work packages that are used for accounting purposes, they aggregate cost and time. All of those work packages eventually will roll up into one or more control accounts that aggregate certain major functionalities into them. You have several of those, and then those will all roll up into a final total cost and duration accounting package way at the top, which is your main deliverable that's built, all put together. That's your control account. And of course, we talk about work package. There it is. A management control point, scope, budget, cost, schedule is compared. When we get to earned value, you use that to determine whether you're still on track with your original baseline and your costing and so on. We'll see that when we talk about cost management. You have this concept of a planning package, which could be a companion to any of these work packages. And what the planning package is, it's below the control account, and it has work in it, but it doesn't have any detailed activities. It's used to, as a reference to make sure things aren't missed. Okay, so make sure you do this, make sure your work packages and your actual work process include these kind of things. It's just called planning. So you can plan your work breakdown structure properly, and you should leave it in there as reference ongoing, because if requirements change, you may want to tweak that so you make sure that you get stuff in the real accounts down there. Planning package. And then you have your work package that we talked about. The lowest level of decomposition is the actual discrete work activity you're going to do, and it has, of course, cost and duration in it, and you manage to that. And it all rolls up into your work package or your control accounts. So that's the work breakdown structure. Now here's the dictionary again. These are the kinds of elements that are in the dictionary that expound upon what I mentioned earlier. You have an account ID, so you can keep track of these things, and it should be the same account ID as your actual work breakdown activity. A description of the work to do. Any assumptions and constraints would be in here. Major milestones that you need to meet would be in here too. You've got your scheduled activities, your required resources to build it. Now resources could be people, or they could be equipment, rental equipment, material, 52 cubic feet of concrete, whatever's required to build this one little work activity item. It's got to be in there. Cost estimates for it, for materials and people. Quality requirements. When I build this, we've got to make sure it's within certain tolerances, that kind of thing. Acceptance criteria is a big one. Now that I've built this, how can I advance this little item and get it approved and accepted so that I can actually officially make it part of the deliverable up here, the work package and the deliverable acceptance criteria. Any technical references that you need or have used to execute that activity should be in there. And any agreement information, maybe you have agreements with third parties to help do something or whatever, but agreement information would be in there. And the blue stuff, by the way, what do you think that is? Your schedule activities, resource requirements, cost estimates. That's your triple constraint at work again. So it's always there. So that's your dictionary again. So you got your WBS, your work items, and then who, how long, what's going to cost to do it. That's your dictionary. These things are changed only by formal change control. So if your project is large enough or complex enough or long enough in duration to use rolling wave planning, where you know for sure that you have detailed stuff here, you're good, but 2, 3, 4 months out, it's kind of nebulous, but you've kind of planned an aggregate for it, because you'll need to do that for your project funding requirements that we'll see when we talk about cost management. You need to know in advance how much money you're going to need out of your authorized budget to be available at that time to pay for things. You need to make a good swag at it then, and you refine it later to be more exact. But once that stuff starts advancing more toward you, you're going to have to like detail it out better, and you will then need change control to update your WBS dictionary with the actual resource requirements and costs and so on. Why? Because your dictionary is part of your scope baseline. What does that mean? Well, your baseline, and what does that mean? You can't change it without change control. So whenever you start to refine stuff out there, you got to have change control to approve it. So always in there, always integrated change control. Especially your baseline is very critical. So that's the scope baseline, and by this time you have your WBS created, which is the lowest level of work that you can now give to someone when you're ready to do that, once you get your schedule, to go out and actually create this stuff, the actual deliverables, finally. Now your project documents that could be updated are your requirements documents. The approved WBS through change request may modify the requirements document that is in between your WBS and the scope statement. It's up here. You may want to tweak that, make sure that's right, so it's now in sync with your scope statement. And that's a project document. And that's about it for creating your WBS. So now what we've done is we've established your scope management plan. We've established the scope baseline. Got your scope statement, but particularly your scope baseline, which is your scope statement, WBS dictionary. You're ready to rock and roll now with your project schedule, network diagrams, and do all that so you can execute this WBS in a managed way. But before we get there, that's chapter 6 and 7, before we get there, we're going to complete our discussion of scope management by talking about once we get the stuff built, how you validate the scope. Remember, life cycle of deliverable, we know about validate, but then control the scope, which is what happens when things are out of whack. How do you control it, bring it back into compliance with your baselines? So that'll be in module 13 that we'll talk about next.